and reduce the biomass of grass or reduce grass growth or reduce grass reproduction, something like that. And then the final part of this is that there has to be this indirect positive effect of the wolf on the grass. And that's the trophic cascade. The challenge here is that that's good for the herbivores. Herbivores cue into that abundant grass, and then carnivores cue into those abundant herbivores. So you get that same positive correlation between the carnivore and the plant, but for a really different reason than the trophic cascade. So there's an alternative here. And the alternative might be familiar to anybody who's ever been to a savanna ecosystem, where we've got this balance between trees and grasses. We've got too many trees to call it a proper grassland, but we've got too many grasses to call it a proper forest or a proper woodland. And so, as many of you know, a lot of folks think that to maintain this kind of tree grass codominance, this tree grass balance, you've got to have things like elephants, or you've got to have things like fire. And then the absence of those disturbances, maybe this open savanna would transform into a closed canopy woodland. And so that idea that we just went through, that alternative to the trophic cascade, has nothing to do with predators, right? You didn't hear me mention lions or hyenas or leopards or anything like that in that explanation. And so when I was a very young mammologist, I had an advisor. My advisor, she said something to me and she said, you know what, if you're a serious scientist, you got to go out and try and disprove your favorite hypothesis. And so my favorite hypothesis has always been the trophic cascades hypothesis. And so I wanted to go out and disprove it. I wanted to show that it was wrong. And I thought the best place to show that it was wrong was in an East African savanna, because I thought this tree grass balance was going to be all about rainfall and fire and elephants. So Leo and several of my other students and I have been working in Laikipia County for a while. As some of you know, Laikipia County is about 10,000 square kilometers. There's a lot of wildlife in Laikipia, right? In particular, it's got the highest abundances of big mammals outside the Masai Mara and outside the Serengeti over all of East Africa. What's interesting is that many of you also know that this is mostly private ranches. So we've got private land holdings and this huge wealth of large mammals that are occurring outside national parks and reserves. What I'm showing you here on the left is a map of the Impala Conservancy. Maybe some of you have been to this property. And on Impala, we've got two real broad soil types. The first of these is a red sand savanna, and red sand is pretty bushy. A lot of trees, there's a good diversity of trees. And in contrast, we've got what we call a black clay or black cotton savanna, where we've pretty much got a single species of tree, and that tree is a whistling thorn tree. Most of what I'm going to talk about today occurs on this red sand savanna, at least for the first story. And the second story, we're going to get into some black clay. So we've got a fancy title on this slide. The title is Energetic Equivalence for these three browsers. And these are the three most common wild ungulates on Impala. And so on this graph here on the left, what I'm showing you is biomass density. So kilograms per square kilometer. And sure enough, what you see is that, wow, elephants weigh a lot. And the biomass density for elephants is really high. compared to Impala and compared to Dik-Dik. But what's kind of cool is that elephants and Impala and Dik-Dik, they all eat roughly the same amount, okay? So these gray bars are the amount of calories or the amount of energy that is consumed. So even though our biomass density for elephants is way higher than that of Impala and Dik-Dik, the amount of energy that they're consuming on the landscape is about the same. So what that means is that if we're interested in this idea of a trophic cascade, we should pay as much attention to Impala and the Dik-Dik as we pay to elephants. And so most of you know that elephants are not eaten by very many predators. They're so big that they can turn on a would-be predator and fight and kill it, okay? In contrast, we've got Impala. They weigh 40 to 50 kgs. They're what we call a harem defense polygynist. So the bulls will defend harems of 10 to 100 females, and those females are territorial. And Impala are mixed feeders. They'll eat grasses, they'll eat forbs, and they'll eat woody vegetation. And to get away from would-be predators, they run. And then finally, we've got this cute little gal here at the bottom. So this is about the size of your house cat, if you've got a big house cat. They're weird for a mammal. They're monogamous. They're among the 1% of mammals that form pair bonds. They're a true browser, so they eat mostly trees. And unlike elephants and Impala, the way that they avoid predation is they hide from their predators. Okay. So on top of all that, we've also got variation in how these trees defend themselves. So these trees don't just sit around waiting to be eaten by an ungulate. They defend themselves with spines and thorns and chemicals, and in this instance, ants, okay? And so in this landscape at Impala, we've got Acacia brevispica, we've got Acacia mellifera, we've got Acacia atbica, and then on the black cotton, we've got this Acacia drepanalobium. I'm not going to talk much about that one today, but it's a really cool tree for a number of reasons. So we've got differences in body size of ungulates. We've got differences in how plants defend themselves. And so for this story, we wanted to focus mainly on Impala. So for now, just forget about elephants and forget about Dik-Diks, and we want to focus on that 40 to 45 kg Impala. So we want to ask this question: how does the fear of being eaten and the thorniness of those trees affect where trees live? And so like I mentioned before, this was done in collaboration with two former students and now good buddies, Adam Ford. He's at the University of British Columbia in Canada, and Toby Otieno, who some of you might know, he's with the Wasso Lions. So to ask this question, we actually broke it down into 3 questions. So if you remember at the first part of our talk, we had this trophic cascades idea, and then we broke it down into the 3 things that had to happen to get that cascade. And so the 3 questions are this: do Impala select habitat to reduce the risk of being eaten? It's question number 1. Question 2 is, do Impala prefer to eat these less thorny trees? So this guy here at the bottom left. And then finally, does the fear that Impala have of being eaten actually protect the less thorny trees? So we're going to walk through these questions kind of one by one. So the first thing we wanted to do was learn something about habitat selection of Impala. Where do they go? Where do they spend their time? So to do that, we identified 20 herds of Impala. And from each of those herds, we collared a single adult female, and we fixed a radio collar on her. And these radio collars were really resolute. They gave us highly detailed information about the habitat selection and movements of impala. In particular, they took a GPS fix, once every hour for about 2 years. We also had the good fortune of having telemetered wild dogs and telemetered leopards. So we've got impala, wild dogs, and leopards, all of which are GPS collared. We performed a tree cover classification from satellite imagery, from remotely sensed imagery. And so to convince you that we're collaring the right predators, what I'm showing you here on the left is the proportion of impala kills from different carnivores. And what you can see is that between leopards and wild dogs, they're killing about 80% of the impala on this property. So this comes from kill site surveys. So Impala is a really secure ranch. There's anti-poaching patrols and security that goes out all the time. And a lot of times when these guys go out, they'll stumble on a kill. So as soon as they did that, they took photos, they recorded data, what was the species, what tracks are around it. So we're confident that leopards and wild dogs are the main predators of this herbivore. Okay, whoop. So what I'm showing you here is a graph that we're going to fill with data. And on the y-axis, we've got the probability of selection. In other words, what's the probability that these species are going to use a type of habitat? And the type of habitat I'm showing you is woody cover. So it increases from 0 to 1, from 0% to 100%. And so what we saw, and we've got 3 different lines here, what we saw is that as the landscape got bushier, impala tended to avoid it. So way over here on the left, we've got impala using open areas. And as we get bushier and bushier, impala are using the landscape less. So they're using open areas on the landscape. In contrast to that, their main predators, both leopards and wild dogs, are doing just the opposite. Leopards and wild dogs are spending their time in bushy areas. So now what I'm showing you is a similar graph, but instead of the probability of use on that y-axis, what I'm showing you is risk of mortality. The risk that an impala is going to be killed given that it's there. On the x-axis, we've still got woody cover, which is going to increase from left to right. And what you should see here is that bushier areas are way more dangerous to impala than open areas. As we move from left to right and things get bushier, the risk of mortality increases very steeply and then levels off. So we've got 2 things going on here. The first is that impala are using open areas. They're avoiding areas that are bushier. But given that they occur in those bushy areas, they're getting killed more, okay? So the next thing that we wanted to do was a big experiment. So when we started this work, we knew that we were going to find lots of impala inside these glades. So most people probably know what a glade is, but if you don't, what a glade is this nice, juicy, green, nutritious spot right on the landscape. And that glade is left by a boma. So we corral or boma cattle in this landscape. They're put in a boma for about a month. Then the boma is moved and all that dung and urine breaks down and creates this delicious patch of grass. So in addition to this being a delicious patch of grass, if you look at it, you can also see that it's pretty open. And remember that impala like to select for those open areas. And so you go out here and you drive around at night and you'll see that a lot of times these glades have impala in them. They'll have 50 to 100 impala sometimes. And so what we've got here is a satellite image and we've got 2 glades, and then we've got a thicket. And so over the course of our study, what we did was we tracked these impala for about 2 years. And so what I'm showing you here is the movements of a single impala over 2 years' time. And each of these black dots is an hourly fix from its GPS collar. And so what you should notice is, wow, sure enough, those impala love those glades. It's a good thing those GPS collars are telling us what we already knew. But what those GPS collars told us that we didn't already know was how much impala avoid these luggas, how much they avoid these thickets. So look at how few times those red lines cross the thicket. And so that made us start to think, well, could it be that impala are using these glades not so much for food, but for safety? We always thought that they just hung out in the glades because there was really good grass there. But what the impala started telling us with their movements was that they might be using the glades just as much for safety. So the thing that we had to do was disentangle or tease apart the fact that inside a glade it's really visible, but also inside a glade there's a lot of good food, there's a lot of good grass. So to do that, we conducted this big experiment. And what we did is we went with pongas and we removed a bunch of trees in these half-hectare clearings. So we're basically making a sham glade. Those sham glades have really high visibility. They're really open, just like a real glade. But unlike a real glade, there's not a lot of good grass there. And so what we predicted would happen, what we expected would happen, is that if impala are using glades for safety, they ought to start spending lots of time in our sham glades. And so sure enough, that's what you see on this bar graph on the right. We've got the proportion of GPS locations inside those sham glades, and they're increasing by a factor of 2 to 500%. Okay, so that's a lot of information that I just threw at you. Hopefully you're still with me. But remember, the question we were trying to answer was, do impala select habitat to reduce risk of being eaten? So what we've talked about for the last 10 minutes, we come up with our answer, and that answer is yes. They are selecting habitat to reduce risk of being eaten. Now to our second question. Do impala prefer to eat this less thorny tree, this thing on the bottom left, as opposed to this thing on the bottom right? So if you remember, in this landscape, we've got 2 trees that are pretty common. One is Acacia brevispica, one is Acacia atbica. Acacia brevispica, as you can see, normally doesn't have thorns on it, or if it has thorns, they're really tiny. They're like less than a centimeter. On the other hand, Acacia atbica has these big white 3 to 5 centimeter thorns. So if you were an impala, or if I was an impala, I thought, well, I'd rather eat this brevispica than this atbica, only because of the thorns. So these are control thornless branches in the light green, and in the dark green, we have control thorny branches. So the thing that we then did, and this is mostly Toby Otieno's work, the thing that we then did was we cut a bunch of thorns from the normally thorny Acacia atbica. We removed a bunch of thorns from the normally thorny Acacia atbica, and we tied those thorns on to the normally thornless Acacia brevispica. So we've got control brevispica, we've got control atbica, and we've got a thorn removal atbica, and finally a thorn addition brevispica. And the expectation is this: if it's thorns by themselves that are determining what impala like to eat, we ought to be able to remove thorns from the normally thorny Pejita and tie those thorns on to the normally thornless Brevispica and change how tasty those trees are for Impala. And so we did this with a series of what are called cafeteria feeding trials, believe it or not. Just like when you go to a cafeteria at a restaurant or something like that, you've got 20 different things and you can grab some of this or some of that or some of that. Most people aren't grabbing some of all 20 of the things. They're selecting 1 or 2 or 3 things from that cafeteria. And you're probably going to select the things that you like to eat the most. And so we thought Impala would do the same thing. So we made some Impala cafeterias with 4 groups of branches. And this is what we saw. Sure enough, that poorly defended Acacia brevispica was really tasty. When these bars are above 1, it means those Impala are selecting those branches. So Impala thought those poorly defended Acacia brevispica were tasty. What was interesting was that when we removed the thorns from the Pejita that was normally well defended, they were just as tasty to Impala. You get rid of the thorns and suddenly Impala want to eat it. And conversely, if we add thorns to the brevispica, we can make it nasty. The Impala doesn't like to eat it. So in nature, what's happening are this bar A and D. We've got a poorly defended brevispica and we've got a well-defended Pejita. And Impala love to eat the brevispica. They hate to eat the Pejita. The reason for that, it's all about thorns. So, do Impala prefer to eat this less thorny tree? Yes, they do. And so the final question that we wanted to ask, we wanted to put 2 and 2 together from our first 2 questions. And we wanted to answer the question, does the fear of predation that Impala feel actually protect this less thorny brevispica? We know that the thorns do a good job of protecting the Pejita. So thorns protect the Pejita because those thorns do what they're supposed to do. They make it nasty to eat. So this question is basically what protects the brevispica? So now what I'm showing you is 4 bars, okay? And these 4 bars go hand in hand with different levels of woody cover. So less than 10%, 10 to 20%, 20 to 30%, and less than 30%. And so what I'm showing you here is that about 70% of Impala locations are in areas where there's very little woody cover. We already knew that. This is just a different way of showing you the same thing. But what's cool is that if we look at how these 2 trees occur on the landscape, what we see is that Acacia brevispica, that thing that doesn't have thorns on it, it gets more common the denser the bush gets. And on the other hand, we have this well-defended Acacia Pejita. It gets less common the denser the bush gets. So in dense bush, we've got thornless brevispica. In open areas, we've got really thorny Pejita. And remember, it's these open areas where Impala live because they think they're safe there, okay? And then finally, even within their home ranges, Impala are using these open areas. So if we make a map of all this, what we see looks something like this. So on the left, what I'm showing you is those 4 bends of woody cover. Darker is denser, darker is bushier, lighter is more open. These black dots are from a single Impala over the course of a year. I just picked one of them, but they all look like this. And what you can see is that those Impala are hanging out in open areas, but they're really avoiding those dark, bushy areas. On the right, what I'm showing you is risk of mortality. okay? When risk of mortality is low, it's green on the map. When risk of mortality is high, it's red on the map. And so sure enough, risk of mortality is really high in those bushy areas, and risk of mortality is low in those open areas. And the final bit I'm going to show you is how the distribution of these trees changes with openness and with risk. So more open means it's safer for Impala. More bushy means it's riskier for Impala. Where it's risky for Impala, Acacia brevispica thrives. It thrives because instead of defending itself with thorns, the risk of predation is defending it, okay? On the other hand, where we've got this super thorny Atbica, it does really well in open areas. It does well where Impala choose to spend their time because it can defend itself with these big 5-centimeter thorns. So what's happening is that we're getting a trophic cascade in this landscape, but only with the poorly defended tree. We're only getting a trophic cascade with that thornless tree. And so what this means is that large carnivores like leopards and African wild dogs are actually making the entire landscape less thorny, okay? Large carnivores are making this landscape less thorny. So that was the first story. And if there's not any questions, we'll move to the second story. And the second story is this weird saying, the enemy of my enemy is my enemy. And the question that we're trying to answer in this story is, can we use cattle ranching to provide a refuge for a rare antelope? And the vast majority of this work was done by Caroline and Guino. So Caroline was a PhD student at the University of Wyoming, and we worked together until about 2017. And she's now working with the Pride of Meru program with Born Free. Some of this work is also with my master's student, Douglas Kamaru. And so we're now going to shift from Impala Conservancy to Old Pejita Conservancy. And we're going to start with an observation. And so on Impala, our three most common wild ungulates were elephants, Impala, and dik-dik. Most everywhere else in Laikipia, the two most common ungulates are plain zebra and cattle. And so because of work that Nick Georgiadis conducted with DRSRS, we have this really nice time series of data for ungulates in Laikipia, going back all the way to 1985. And what you can see here is that densities of zebra and cattle are changing through time. They vary a lot through time, but you wouldn't look at these and say that they're declining. And the reason is because both zebra and cattle numbers in this landscape are controlled mostly by rainfall. They're controlled what we call bottom up by rainfall. In contrast to zebra and cattle, we've got a bunch of other wild ungulates that have all been declining through time. And those declines coincided with the mid-1980s. So we've got things like hartebeest, waterbuck, eland, buffalo, greater kudu could also be put on here. But what you notice about all four of these species is that the data kind of look the same for all four of them. And when the data kind of look the same, you think there might be a single underlying cause. And one thing that coincided with declines in all four of those species is that many of the landowners in Laikipia became more tolerant of lions in the mid-1980s. So historically, lions were lethally controlled by shooting or by poisoning. And there's been a change in mindset over about the last 30 years or so, and landowners have become a bit more tolerant of lions. in part because it's the ethical thing to do, in part because lions also boost tourism economies. So we have all of these observations, right? Zebra and cattle are on the landscape, and their numbers vary through time, and they're controlled by rainfall. Hartebeest, buffalo, etc., have been declining since the mid-1980s, and those declines have coincided with an increased tolerance of lions. So this is Old Pejita Conservancy, and this is where Caroline did most of her work. The thing I want you to notice about this property, one, it's huge. It's about over 300 square kilometers. And we've got kind of this peninsula in the southwest that's outlined in red. And this is a lion exclusion zone. So it's a big fence. Lions are trapped and moved out of it. But I want you to keep that lion exclusion zone in mind compared to the rest of the property. So a few slides before, I showed you these 4 species of declining wild ungulates, and one of those is Jackson's hartebeest. So Jackson's hartebeest is this unique race of hartebeest. It's a hybrid between Lelwell and Koch's hartebeest. Only occurs in Laikipia. Because of that, a lot of folks really like this thing. It's a relative of the better known blue wildebeest. Unlike wildebeest, this thing is relatively sedentary. It sets up territories of about 4 to 5 square kilometers, and it defends them. So it doesn't move around on the landscape as much as wildebeest do. And it doesn't move around on the landscape as much as zebra do. And so on Old Pejita, just like on Impala, we've got these security teams. And those security teams walk through the bush a couple times a day, and they often come across carcasses of wild ungulates. And so I'm showing you 6 panels here, and 5 of those panels are particular species of wild ungulates. And what's on the x-axis is the carnivore that we think killed them. So what you should notice is that lions, the one all the way to the left on each of these panels, lions are doing most of the predation on buffalo, on hartebeest, on warthog, and on zebra. Less so on Impala, where it's mostly leopard and cheetah. So the other observation that we had was that inside that lion exclusion zone, what we saw is that population sizes of hartebeest were much higher. So on the left, what I'm showing you here is population sizes of hartebeest and their population growth on the y-axis. So the thing to keep in mind is that when population growth, that little r equals 0, means a population is stable. When our little r is higher than 0, our population is growing. When our little r is lower than 0, our population is shrinking. So what you see is that throughout Old Pejita, in the control area of Old Pejita, population size of hartebeest is, well, let me start over here. What you see in the control of Old Pejita is that population growth of hartebeest never really reaches stability. Populations of hartebeest are declining on that property. But if we go to the lion exclusion zone, what we see is that growth rates in general are high. Populations are growing. So what this implies is that it's lions that are suppressing population growth of hartebeest. So in light of that, what Caroline wanted to do is ask the lions, what do you like to eat? What's your favorite food? And so to do that, what she did was she GPS collared 5 female lions. And each of those was a dominant lioness from 5 different prides. And those prides added up to about 70 individuals, or most of the lion population at Old Pejita. She was able to equate movements of those individuals with pride level movements because lions on Old Pejita form these cohesive prides. Then what she did was something that was very clever. And she developed an algorithm based on those GPS locations to identify potential kill sites. And she defined potential kill sites as GPS locations, as 2 or more GPS locations that were within 100 meters of each other. So a potential kill site was when we had 2 or more successive locations within 100 meters of each other. So it kind of looks like this. We've got this map of Old Pejita, and up here, we've got this cluster of GPS points. Because when lions make a kill, they usually sit on it for a while. They sit and rest and eat it for some time. So in total, over about 3 years, she found 368 potential kill sites, and she went in and visited all of them. And of those 368, about 2/3 of them were in fact lion kills, okay? For about 99, there was no carcass found. And then for about 23, there were potential scavenging events. So we have nearly 250 kills of wild ungulates that could be attributable to lions. And so what she did was she asked the lions a pretty simple question. She said, okay, you've got all these ungulates in this landscape. Do you prefer these ungulates? Do you prefer this species? Do you avoid this species? Or do you eat this species in proportion to its abundance? So what I'm showing you here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 species of wild ungulates. And I'm showing you a selection index for each of them. When that selection index is at 0, it means that that ungulate is being eaten in proportion to its abundance. It's eaten as much as we would expect given how common it is. When the selection index is less than 1, lions are avoiding eating it. And when it's greater than 1, lions are preferring to eat it. So you can see that in both wet and dry seasons, lions love to eat hartebeest. They eat way more hartebeest than we would expect based on the abundance of hartebeest. Lions are eating zebra in proportion to their abundance, okay? But this doesn't mean they're eating fewer zebra than hartebeest. Lions are eating a lot more zebra than hartebeest because there's a lot more zebra on the landscape. It's just that they're eating hartebeest disproportionately more than would be expected based on the abundance of hartebeest. So lions select hartebeest. They eat zebra in proportion to the abundance of zebra. And so now we've got this fancy term, and that term is called apparent competition. And this is a conservation challenge that we see a lot of the time when large carnivores recolonize an area or when they're restored to an area. And so what we think is going on in Laikipia is this. And this was a hypothesis first proposed, we think, by Nick Georgiadis. And I think we finally have the data to test it. So what's happening is that the recolonization of lions to the Laikipia Plateau has been fueled by a really abundant population of zebra. But that really abundant population of zebra that gives rise to a population of lions, that lion population doesn't just eat zebra. In fact, it loves to eat hartebeest. But hartebeest aren't common enough that they can sustain a big population of lions. So what happens is that lion predation drives down hartebeest numbers, but instead of lion populations declining with hartebeest, lions just switch to eating zebra. So what we have here is this negative indirect effect that zebra are having on hartebeest. The enemy of my enemy is my enemy. So we think that hartebeest are suffering from lots of lion predation because there's a big zebra population. And so we thought that cattle ranching practices might hold the key to solving this problem, because nobody in Lake Hippia really wants to go out and shoot lots of lions, but many people in Lake Hippia like having hartebeest around. So is there a way that we can have our cake and eat it too? And so here's kind of what Caroline was thinking, and here's what we did. So we know that in this landscape, we can boma cattle. We remove the boma, the dung and urine break down, and they create a grazing lawn. Those grazing lawns we knew were really attractive to zebra, and that if you put a boma on the landscape and you move it, about a year later, a grazing lawn develops and it becomes like a magnet for zebra. And the zebra change where they spend their time. They're all attracted to that glade, just like Impala were in the first story. But critically, when zebra move into the glade, hartebeest don't. Hartebeest stay right where they were. So what we could do, or what we tried to do, was create spatial separation between where hartebeest occurred on the landscape and where zebra occurred on the landscape. And we knew that lions mainly ate zebra. If there were hartebeest in the area with zebra, we thought those lions are going to eat hartebeest. But if we can create spatial separation in the landscape between where zebra occur and where hartebeest occur, we might be able to give hartebeest a foothold and create a refuge by which they could escape predation. So to test this idea, we made a bunch of glades. I think we made 18 or 20 of them at Old Pejita. We standardized the size of these glades. We standardized the number of cattle that were in these glades. We standardized the amount of time the glades were on the landscape. We left them on the landscape for about a month. And then over the course of a year, a glade formed. And so as those glades were forming, what we did was we just did simple line transects and went out with binoculars and rangefinders and asked, okay, which of these ungulates are being attracted to these glades? So on this map here at the bottom, we've got all these little X's. Those are our experimental glades. And then we've got selection from low in green to high in red. And what you should see here is that zebra really like glades. They were attracted to glades just like we thought they'd be. In contrast, hartebeest showed just the opposite. They either avoided glades or they never used them to begin with. So we were able to create spatial separation between zebra, the most common prey of lions, and hartebeest, the favorite prey of lions, by creating these glades. And sure enough, if you look at survival of hartebeest as a function of whether or not it's got a glade in its territory, hartebeest without glades in their territory, so this solid black line, those hartebeest survived at about twice the rate as hartebeest with glades in their territory. So given that hartebeest are sedentary and they have these territories, you could go to Old Pejita and you could work with the cattle managers there and say, well, we've got hartebeest here, here, and here. If we put glades away from hartebeest, we're going to pull the lion prey, the zebras, toward those glades, create spatial separation, give the hartebeest a refuge, and increase the survival of hartebeest. So this was kind of we thought this was a clever way that we could combine livestock production in this landscape with conservation of this Jackson's hartebeest without having to resort to lethal control of lions. So that's the end of that story, but you might have a few questions. And the first question you might be asking yourself was, well, how is it that hartebeest coexisted with lions for hundreds or thousands of years without having to do all this complicated stuff with glades? And so one of the ways that we kind of think about carnivore restoration, I think, is that we've got this historical baseline. So in Laikipia, that historical baseline was the 1950s and before. We had lions and we had hartebeest in the landscape. For 30 to 40 years, those lions were lethally controlled and hartebeest increased. And now maybe we assume that if we put lions back into the landscape, those hartebeest populations will revert to the historical baseline. But that way of thinking assumes that nothing else has changed between the 1950s and the 1980s. But we know that there's a lot of things that have changed in this landscape. So one is that fire used to be a lot more common. So in our historical baseline pre-1950s, we have lions, hartebeest, and fire creating open habitats. With lethal control of lions also came fire suppression. And with fire suppression also came a lot more trees. So now lions get put back into the landscape where there's no fire, there's a lot more trees, and we don't know what's going to happen to the hartebeest population. It probably won't go back to this historical baseline. And it may be that lions are more effective at killing hartebeest because there's a lot more tree cover around for them to use to hide and kill prey. The other question, and this is just a thought experiment, why not eliminate glades and cattle to bolster hartebeest survival? So as I mentioned before, cattle and plain zebra are the most common ungulates in this landscape. They both eat grass, they're both grazers. But the interesting thing about cattle is that compared to zebra and other wild ungulates, lions don't eat many cattle. They're put in those big predator-proof bomas. Sometimes lions will get in there, sometimes lions will eat a cow in the field, but they don't eat cattle like they eat zebra. So you get rid of cattle, and what might happen is that suddenly you have even more zebra than you had before. And with even more zebra might come even more lions and even more predation on hartebeest. In addition to all of that, and more importantly, there's a lot of people who make their living off cattle production and pastoralism. So it is ethically not feasible, and it's probably impossible to remove cattle from this ecosystem. So I think with that, I'll stop. And if anybody has any questions or comments, I'd be happy to chat with you. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Goheen, for that very detailed talk. So participants, if you have questions, feel free to raise your hands. If you have a comment, feel free to also share. So any questions? Simon Musila, do you have anything to say from the mammal community?
Yeah, at least even if it's not, I don't have any question. I can thank Jake very much for at least finding time to come and speak to us online. Jake.
Simon.
Jake. Yes. Yeah, how are you?
Good, buddy. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. So I'm saying, yeah, I mean, the talk is good, and I would like to thank you so much for coming. I think my only question is, okay, your study is taking place in conservancies, kind of not natural habitats in the way that we know, because these areas are kind of taken care of, and they wouldn't represent the kind of disturbed habitat that are out there. So given that, how would you say would happen in an area which is not actually a ranch, given that people would be moving in cattle there in large numbers, and grazing would be enormous.
Yeah,
Yeah, because
Simon.
that is the
Yeah,
kind of natural, that is the kind of environment that exists out there, not few ranches as you have shown in at Impala and or Pejita.
Simon, I'm glad that this isn't my PhD defense, and I'm glad you're not my advisor, because that's a really good question. You would have pinned me with it. And all I can tell you is that I agree 100%. So the reason I am not sure how well this method would work elsewhere. I don't even know if it would work outside of Laikipia. The reason that I think it works at Opejda, there's a bunch of reasons. The first is that Opejda gets a lot of rainfall, number one. And because it gets a lot of rainfall, you can have a lot of grazing and the grass regenerates. So that's the first thing. Number two is that the bomas that were being used on Opejda were chain link predator-proof bomas that were reinforced with steel. And because of that, they are essentially lion-proof. They're way better at keeping out lions than, for example, thorn trees, and they're easier to move around. So you can create those, those grazing hotspots, those glades on the landscape. The other reason I think it worked is because of the natural history quirk with hartebeest. So hartebeest don't move around a lot. We took advantage of the fact that hartebeest were not attracted to glades to create that spatial separation and give them a foothold from lion predation. If you were to ask me, how you could tweak this method to use outside of Laikipia, I would need to think about it for a little bit. But again, I think it works because lots of rainfall, really good reinforced bomas, and kind of the natural history quirks of hartebeest. I don't think it will work everywhere.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much for Jake for replying.
Yes. We have a few questions. One from Harry Wells. Harry Wells, are you able to voice the question? Or do I just read it?
So I can read them because I'm seeing them on my chat.
Yes.
So what Harry asks is there any evidence that cattle suppress zebra populations at the scale of entire ranches? I believe so, yes. And it's in a paper by Keesing et al., 2018 in Nature Sustainability. That stated that cattle densities have to be pretty high to keep zebra out. Zebra often are going to be the last things to go. So before you see zebra go as a function of cattle densities, you're going to see things like buffalo go. So that's the answer to his first question. And then to what extent the opening of habitats by elephant populations indirectly facilitates other herbivores, reducing tree density. So he's saying if you have elephants create visibility and facilitate other herbivores, that's a great question. So Caroline worked a little bit on that, and another member of our research group, Douglas Kamaru, is working on that very thing. And what Douglas has discovered is that on Opejda, there's this invasive species of ant called the big-headed ant. And something that we didn't talk about today is that on black cotton soil, you have this whistling thorn tree that defends itself with these ant bodyguards. And what happens is the big-headed ant, the invasive, kills the ant bodyguards, and it renders that tree defenseless against elephants. Elephants come through an invaded area, they knock down trees, and what Douglas is showing is that because of that, zebra are actually surviving better in those areas invaded by big-headed ants. So there's a really, it's kind of unfortunate that it's because of an invasive species, but there's a really interesting sequence of interactions between trees, native ants, invasive ants, elephants, visibility, zebra, and lions. It's playing out across this entire property.
Okay, thank you. There's also another question from Vicky Zero.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, she's asking, were you able to observe any effects of manipulating boma locations for the other species of declining ungulates you mentioned?
So that's a good question. The answer is that we didn't look for it. And the reason that we focused exclusively on hartebeest was that they were sort of easy. And the reason I say that is because you can visit hartebeest territories every week, and the same individuals will be there week in and week out, unless they're killed. So hartebeest don't move around quite as much as things like buffalo or waterbuck or eland. So because hartebeest were sedentary, we could focus on them. In addition, Caroline was really, really good in the field and was able to identify each unique hartebeest based on scars and horn morphology and unique marks. And we couldn't do that with the other declining species. So it's for that reason that we focused on hartebeest.
Okay, there's also another question from Bernard. Thanks a lot, Jake, for these informative findings. In absence of cattle and glades, what other approach do you think could be most applicable in increasing the survival of both hartebeest and impalas?
Mm-hmm. You know, that's a good question. And you know, so one of Caroline's and my collaborators, Nick Georgiadis, did a study where he was looking at hartebeest populations on different ranches. And there was one ranch, and I believe it was Solio Ranch, where there was a big rhino enclosure. And within that rhino enclosure, there were lots of hartebeest. So I hate to say, put up a fence, because fencing is both controversial and expensive. But oftentimes the solutions to these, you know, conservation problems are pretty obvious. And hartebeest seem to do okay in Laikipia, where there's not lots of lions. So that's, you know, that's immediately what comes to mind. The other thing about the question with respect to Impala, you know, it's always interesting to think how many more Impala that we could have on the landscape if there were twice as many glades, or how many fewer Impala we'd have if there were no glades. And right now, you know, I think we're probably at a sweet spot with the number of glades on Impala, the property, because there's a decent population of Impala, but there's also a decent population of the things that eat Impala. And so, you know, maybe you put twice as many glades on the landscape becomes twice as safe, and all of a sudden leopards and African wild dogs can't catch them. So those are just thoughts. I'm not sure I answered your question, Bernard, but that's just kind of what came to me off the top.
Okay, I'll ask John and Margaret Cooper to also voice their question.
You do that one.
Yes. I was just wondering how your studies were affected when there were all this political and social insecurity a few years ago in Laikipia.
Right. So, right.
Greetings from England.
You can
Okay. So thank you. So all of the work on Impala, wild dogs, leopards, tree thorniness, that was all completed prior to 2017. The work on Old Pejita was going on at the time. Old Pejita is pretty darn secure, and it's in the southern part of Laikipia, and most of that grazing came down from Samburu. So luckily we weren't affected very much at all. There were a few other projects that we have going on Impala Conservancy that were, I would say, affected minimally. It wasn't completely catastrophic, but it was a bit of a disruption, but it didn't completely derail us, I think, again, because security is pretty good and because Impala is in the middle of Laikipia as opposed to the north.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Greetings to everyone.
I'm just going out bird watching, hence my attire on my bicycle.
In UK.
Excellent lecture.
But it's a year since we're at an Impala, and we're really missing it.
Yes. Asante sana wote.
Kwaherini.
Kwaherini.
Thanks so much.
There's a hand up from JKN. I don't know the name in full, but please. I'm trying to unmute you. Yes, please. Go ahead. Kindly unmute. I think she has a lot of. Okay, there was a comment from Helen as well. Oh no, not the dreaded big-headed ants. Another NK talk topic. I think it was a suggestion. Anyway, there are also some positive comments. People saying that the talk was very informative from Mary Kageni and also from Dr. Mugimwa Juguna and Asha Tumaini. They're saying it was a very informative talk. Thank you. I see another question from Helen. Will any of this research be relevant to the welfare of the Hillora antelope?
I think I saw Dr. Abdullahi Ali on here. I would punt that question to him.
Sawa.
I mean, I think Ali's doing a great job with Hirola. I think, you know, one of the, at least from what I've seen, you know, whenever you've got lions or some other carnivore eating wild ungulates, there are always going to be fewer ungulates than if those lions or wild, large carnivores weren't there. But I think what Ali has shown very convincingly is that with Hirola, it's a lot about range degradation. And so he and his group have focused a lot of time and energy on range restoration. So bringing back the grass layer through a number of different techniques. And I think the early signs indicate that it's working. So despite being, a pretty close relative of hartebeest, I think the reasons Hirola are not doing great have to do more with range deterioration than they do predation.
Okay. Okay, Harry Wells also has another comment. I think Kessing et al. Showed no correlation between cattle and plain zebras abundance.
I'd trust Harry on that. It's been a while since I've read that paper. You know, I think Simon Musilla asked the question, you know, well, Laikipia is kind of weird because you've got these huge ranches, not many cattle on them. How does it expand to the rest of Kenya? And I do remember from that Keesing et al. Paper that most of the, I think she had three kinds of properties: conservancies, mixed use, and group ranches. And the cattle densities in her study never got very high. In other words, if you were going to see competition between zebra and cattle, one of those two species would have to be pretty abundant. And I think throughout the properties on her study, there weren't tons of cattle. This is just by memory. I'd have to read it again. I actually reviewed that paper before it was published, but I haven't read it for a while, so I've kind of forgotten the punchlines on it.
So Musina also had a question. Do you think cattle suppress the lion population on Pejita?
So, you know, I think they certainly could. I think it's possible. So you imagine there's no cattle on that ranch, and maybe there's more zebra, and with more zebra, maybe there's more lions. I have no idea if that's true or not. It's a hypothesis. I could see it either way, and I feel like there's good reasons to believe they might, and there's good reasons to believe they might not, but that's a really good question.
Okay, thanks for the answers. I see no other questions.
This JKN has their hand up, whoever that is.
Let me try to unmute again. JKN, please unmute yourself. I'm trying to unmute you. Okay. Anyway, I don't know if Simon Musila has any other closing remarks.
Yes, Gloria, thank you so much. Yeah, it seems no questions are forthcoming, but yeah. First, I would like to thank our speaker today for finding time to speak to us. I can see, I've been seeing that we have been oscillating up around 42 to 45 participants. This is good for an online talk. When it was advertised, I kind of expected maybe 10 people, but I can see that, yeah, this talk by Professor Jake, it attracted many participants. And this shows that people are actually interested a lot to know more about what is happening about mammals. So this is good. So my great thanks to the speaker, and definitely will continue reaching out to him so that he can also find time to speak to us about his projects and what he's discovering in the field. I want to thank all the participants also finding time to come and also listen to the talk. Without participants, you know, there's no talk. I would like to thank Gloria, Juliet, and Nature Kenya for also providing this platform for the Mammal community. Yeah, so this is a lot of work people are doing to further the understanding, the discussion about mammals in Kenya. We are so glad about this, and for sure we'll continue to engage because we know that there's a lot to learn about mammals. Yeah, so thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much.
Good.
Sorry.
Thanks everybody for listening.
Thank you. And have a nice weekend.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye.